Well, clearly, we're making a play on the word classic. Classic cars, classic theology. The word classic is that which defines a standard of excellence. Lesser things come and go, but a classic holds its value over time. And there was a classic era of American automobile making that was roughly between the 1930s and the 1970s that was characterized by elegant styling, outstanding engineering, and fine workmanship, and those are known as classic cars. And today, if you notice that like never before, people are looking for things of enduring and proven value. Witness the return in most people's lives trying to get farm-grown vegetables, or the treasuring of the family, or respect for the military, things of proven and enduring value. Well, some say to me, Vic, you really ought to keep that pink monster just locked up in your garage. I mean, why are you driving around this 19-foot land yacht that gets 8 miles to the gallon? And I will tell you honestly, it's because I love the conversations I get into, largely with total strangers, which gave me the idea for this series. I got to tell you, I have to actually schedule an extra half hour when I go to a place like Home Depot or down to Publix, because when I come out, often there's a small crowd of people around the car, and they ask me questions. I mean, people hand me their iPhones and say, "Would you snap a picture of me in front of your car?" And there is a recurring conversation that I wind up in, and it goes something like this. Someone will look at me and they will say, "You know, one time in our family, we had a 1954 Ford, or in our family, we had a 1973 Buick." Or a man will say, "Back in my 20s, I had a 1970 Oldsmobile 442 Cutlass that had a hearse shifter on the floor." And then he'll say, "Then I got married." It's always, they blame their wife. Or what sometimes happen is they'll say to me something like, "Well, you know, it got a few rattles, and gas prices were soaring back then, and everybody around me was buying Hondas. And I thought, you know, maybe I was going to end up with a clunker, and so I sold it." And at this point, I have seen grown men with tears in their eyes, and they say, "I'd give anything to have that car back. I would do anything to get that car back." And then I actually had a young woman tell me that her father, years later, went back and bought back the classic T-Bird from the guy he had sold it to before. Well, here's the analogy. We Presbyterians have ridden to church in our classic Calvin for more than 350 years. We've been through a lot of storms together, and she is still performing well. To some people today, she's just an old rattletrap and ought to be thrown onto the scrap heap. But I'll tell you something about our Calvin is that when you see steel, it's really steel. It's not plastic, and there's nothing artificial in it. And what a powertrain has been driving us for almost 4 centuries as we ride in our Calvin. And so what I'd like to invite you to do over the next 4 weeks is I'm going to invite you to hop in to our Calvin and let's go for a ride on Sunday mornings. Well, first of all, the minute we look at our theology, instantly we realize that our Calvin starts in a different place from where a lot of other Christians do. And that is that we don't start with our experience of Jesus. We don't start with how Jesus has changed my life. We start with God. The key that turns our engine and revs us up is, who is God? John Calvin begins his Institutes by saying, without the knowledge of God, we will never know who we are. We soon discover that this car is not our own. We don't own it, and neither do we even own ourselves. Here is a classic quotation of John Calvin. He says, "For how can the idea of God enter your mind without instantly giving rise to the thought that since you are his workmanship, you are bound by the very law of creation to submit to his authority? That your life is due to him. That whatever you do ought to have reference to him. If so, it undoubtedly follows that your life is sadly corrupted if it is not framed in obedience to him. And since his will ought to be the law of our lives." In other words, we ought to have God under our hood, if you might say. But then, of course, you can see immediately that analogy breaks down because God's far bigger than being able to fit under our hood. God fills every square centimeter and every nook and cranny of the entire universe. And in fact, what we find with John Calvin is the staggering doctrine of the sovereignty of God. Calvin gives us the biggest conception of God that any human has ever had. That all things were created by him and for him. He created all things. He is before all things. He is Alpha and Omega. And he's the ruler of all things. And all things are under his control. Only he alone is worthy of worship. You know, wherever you were this summer, as you were looking upon nature, you were gazing upon God's resume. You were witnessing the genius and the majesty of God as you were out in nature. I once spoke with a woman who was had been a professional world-class surfer, and later she became a reporter for CNN. And then after that, today, she's a stay-at-home mom. And I asked her I was at a conference. I said, well, how did you become a Christian? And she said, well, years ago, when I was surfing, I was living on the North Shore of Oahu. And every day I was surfing the legendary breaks of Pipeline and Sunset, Makaha. And there was another surfer who was a Christian, and this other surfer invited me to go to a Bible study one night. And she said, I remember walking in to this house, and here was all of the carpeting the floor were all these other surfers just sitting on the floor. And she said that night the speaker spoke on Psalm 93. What a perfect psalm. Here were the words she heard. The seas have lifted up, O Lord. The seas have lifted up their voice. The seas have lifted up their pounding waves, mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. And all of those surfers looked around and said, whoa, that's gnarly, man. And I'll call her Patty. She giggled after that, and she said to me, the theme that night was from the book of Romans. There is no one cool, no, not one. We serve a God who is so majestic and transcendent and sovereign and holy that next to him, there is no one cool, no, not one. If not to the beach this summer, I hope maybe you had a chance at least to get away from our Atlanta city lights, maybe up into the mountains and look up at the night sky and to witness the wonder of the starry heavens. Here's what Job 9 says. God is the maker of the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. But here's the point I'm trying to point to, and it's mind-boggling, and that is this, that those things we see with our eyes in the heavens is just an infinitesimal dot next to the far-flung wonder of interstellar space. In other words, we're just now beginning to grasp the uncountable works of our God. People like us, we read National Geographics and Astronomy Monthly as devotional literature. It simply tells us of how great and brilliant is our Creator God. Let me give you an example of that. Did you know that if we were to shrink the galaxy of the Milky Way down to the size of North America, and you think about that, Canada and the United States, and if you were to go down to the Cape of Florida and stretch all the way up into the Alaska, but to think about the entire continent of North America is if that were the Milky Way galaxy, let me ask you, how big would our solar system be? It would fit inside a coffee cup. And then stay with me. 35 years ago in 1977, we sent a probe, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, to head out toward the edge of our coffee cup. 35 years later, it has not yet reached the brim of the cup. And today, when scientists beam a message to the Voyager at the speed of light, it takes around 15 hours to get there. And this tiny little star of ours, this solar system in the galaxy of the Milky Way, is one of billions and billions such stars, and we know that there are more than 100 billion galaxies in the universe today. And here we are on this tiny little fleck of dust that is spinning around a minor star at the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. And here you and I are sitting here today as but a fleeting flesh flake who are here today and gone tomorrow in a nanosecond of cosmic time. This is the humility that John Calvin wants to bring us to, next to the wonder and the awesomeness of our God. He wants to inspire worship and obedience before this Creator. Now, today we live in a world where religious people are believing more and more in a God of their own making. A lot of people today are uncomfortable about this great God, and they want a God who's a little more manageable, shall we say. What people will say is things like, well, and you hear this, people will say, well, here's a God I'm comfortable with. And what follows then is a cheap dime store imitation, an incredible shrinking deity. And no one has ever pointed this out better than a current author I want to recommend to you. His name is Ross Douthat. He is the youngest columnist in the history of the New York Times and a very devout Christian. And he has written a book that's out today, and people are reading. It's the buzz in religious circles, and appropriately it's called Bad Religion. What he says is the good news is that 90% of American people believe in God. And then he says the bad news is that the God that American people more and more are believing in is simply the supreme self, an extension of who I am. And I follow the promptings of my own inner spirit. And a lot of people who believe in Jesus believe in a Jesus who is there to serve them. For example, in the prosperity gospel, Jesus is there to give me that big house on the corner. Or in today's psychological Oprah style of religion, I have a God who is within me, who really often is mistaken for my own spirit. I was reading a responsible Christian author the other day who said in this climate we live in today, we need to even be careful about saying to someone that they should invite Jesus into their heart. That even that can be misunderstood. And one of the examples given was about children and acknowledging that children don't understand metaphors. And I read that and I started thinking, that's really true. I'm a brand new grandparent, and my wife Becky and I, a few weeks ago, we were trying to get our 2.5-year-old grandson, James, to go to sleep at night, but he was afraid up in his room because he was saying that there were dragons in his room. Now, think for a moment of the worst possible thing you can say to a 2.5-year-old who doesn't understand metaphors. My dear wife, Becky, said to James, "Oh, James, it's all in your head." He went, dragons are in my head. And he just got hysterical. And something similar can happen in the mind of a child when you say, invite Jesus into your heart. Well, that child could easily grow up thinking Jesus is this tall, sort of the size of a gerbil. And so we need to keep teaching and teaching that child so that child comes to grasp a God who is the majestic God of the Scripture and of John Calvin, a God who will be more than matched for Science 101 someday in college, a God who is transcendent and mighty and brilliant and sovereign over all things. The closer we stay with Calvin, the bigger our God will be. We will sing hymns like we did this morning, invisible, immortal, invisible, God only wise, from light inaccessible, hid from our eyes, most gracious, most glorious, the Ancient of Days. We'll sing songs like How Great Thou Art. We'll sing the great praise song of Rich Mullins, who sang, Our God is an awesome God. We'll use phrases from the Latin like finitum non compax, ad infinitum. The finite cannot comprehend the infinite. We can no more grasp who God is, you and me, than we could capture the Atlantic Ocean in a thimble, or any more than an ant can understand the internet. Our God is so far out there, it's those numbers with 15 zeros behind him to the power of 15 more zeros. And we say, well, I can't even understand that. I can't even grasp that. That is beyond imagining. Well, let me tell you something that is equally ungraspable and equally unimaginable, and that is this, that God who is infinite is also intimate. God is as micro as God is macro. And it is only if you can wrap your mind around those vast polarities that you can even begin to understand Christian theology and the God of the Bible. Now, can I explain that? No. See, around here, we're comfortable with mystery. I mean, how could you ever solve the mystery of the incarnation? I'll admit to you, I roll my eyeballs when I hear preachers say, well, someday when we get to heaven, we'll understand it all. You tell me where it says that in the Bible. We're going to be as smart as God is someday. I'll tell you, much of what we believe in, to paraphrase the words of Winston Churchill, is a mystery inside an enigma, inside a question mark. What we believe oftentimes is something you can't explain. You can only pray. Calvin's great motto was, when the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. There's a story told about one day a student came to John Calvin and flippantly asked, Dr. Calvin, what was God doing before he created the world? Calvin said he was creating hell for people who ask stupid questions. Where the Bible speaks, we speak, and where the Bible is silent, we are silent. We are basing our whole lives on a set of unprovable assumptions. And what a mystery that God, who is infinite, is also intimate. My one goal today for you is that you will leave here with a plausible sense of tiny me am loved by a massive God. And the best place you'll find that is, and I've left it till now, and that is in Psalm 139. Many of you already know the opening line of Psalm 139, and here's what it says: "O Lord, you have searched me and you know me." What it's saying is that God knows us better than even our most intimate relationships here in this world. God knows you better than the most intimate relationships here. "Oh Lord, you have searched me," it says. The word search literally in Hebrew means dig. God has dug into me so that he knows me. How well does God know us? Verse 2. You know when I sit and when I rise. You know me when I sit. You know me in my passive life. Think about that. When I sit on the sofa and I'm wolfing down Doritos and guacamole and I'm glued to the TV watching football, in my downtime when I sit, Lord, you know me. And then when I rise, when I hit the ground running in the morning and I'm just going through my carpool and on my commute and I'm working and I'm doing all this stuff, when I am up in the heat of the day, you know me when I rise. And why you know me so well, it says, you know, you perceive my thoughts from afar. God's a mind reader. At this very moment, God is reading your mind. And then verse 3, you discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. God makes a study of your habits. He finds you a fascinating little creature. And he knows what you do. You discern my going out and so on. And you're familiar with all my ways. If you're an early riser at the crack of dawn, you always go out and pick up the paper, sort of obsessive compulsive person, and everything has it. God takes note of that. You're somebody who always has to have room for cream when you go to Starbucks at the top of the cup. Yep, he knows that as well. God is familiar with all your ways. Verse 4, before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before you have laid your hand upon me. In other words, what the psalmist says is, Lord, you see my actions. You know my thoughts. You know me through and through. As a matter of fact, here is how deep the knowledge of God is in this psalm. And be ready to be just absolutely amazed by this. But what it says, the word know that is used here in this psalm is the very same word for know that is used in Genesis when it says that Adam knew his wife Eve and she bore a son. We're talking deep, intimate, personal knowledge. Being known is the most important experience that we can have as human beings. Oh, it's important. We know we want our child to know certain things like, what does a stoplight mean and not to play with matches, and what is a symbol for poison. We want them to know the state capitals. We want them to know the math tables. But far, far more important is that that child be known, that her parents know her and care about her and know where she is and what she is doing. And is that gives the confidence and identity and character to a child. It is not so much what they know, it is that they are known within the circle of the family. And you see, friends, that's what gives us our identity and our confidence as we go through life, because we are known through and through by our Heavenly Father within the circle of his forever family. And the psalmist says it's too good to be true. He said, verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. The longing to be known. Think about that for a moment. The longing to be known. Could that be much of what is going on all around us in our society, on the internet, and on the posting of Facebook and Twitter and a lot of the blogs? Is there in our society a great spiritual hunger all around us that this very psalm is touching upon? The longing to be known. There's a character in the movie Shall We Dance who says this: we need a witness to our lives. There are billions of people on the planet. I mean, what does any one life really mean? But in a marriage, you're promising to care about everything, the good things, the bad things, the terrible things, the mundane things, all of it, all the time, every day. You're saying your life will not go unnoticed because I will notice it. Your life will not go unwitnessed because I will be your witness. Friend, in your life, there is no moment, there is no feeling, and no experience that is lost. Nothing you do is unnoticed or unseen or unrecorded. Your life is of tremendous significance, and it's not because you made it into the pages of the AJC or because you posted it on Facebook or because you've got a lot of people following you on Twitter. It is because we have an infinite God who is also intimate. And today, many people who are afraid of God, who are turning away of this great God, unbeknownst to them, this is the very God that they are searching for. It takes a God this big in order to fill the emptiness of the human soul. And that is the God that John Calvin brings to us, this infinite, intimate, loving being. And these tiny little godlets that we make for ourselves in the end are going to leave us sad, alone, and empty. God will not let you out of his sight, not for 1 second. You are always with him, and he is always with you. Ponder for a moment what this psalm is saying. Embrace yourself. What it's saying is nothing less than this, that what was true of Jesus is all so true of us. You and I were conceived by the Holy Ghost. And our God knit us together in our mother's womb. And we are fearfully and wonderfully made.